Good morning and welcome to another edition of Steve Quartermain in Conversation With. And today I'm delighted to have as my guest Catriona Riddell. Hello, Catriona.
Hi, Steve.
Listen, I wonder whether it might be a good thing to start the conversation with just asking you to tell us a bit about you and your career to date and how you've ended up talking to me.
Yeah. Well, I've done, I guess, over 30 years now as a strategic planner, and like all strategic planners, I started life in a structure plan team many years ago and stuck with it, despite my boss trying to move me into all sorts of different parts of the planning system. And then sort of ended up, when structure plans were abolished, moving into the regional role, which at the time I was a bit reluctant to do because it was a very big role and I had a young family. But you know, I was really lucky in that chief exec at the Southeast region was very supportive and actually made it happen. And it was, you know, it was fantastic. It was one of the most interesting, rewarding jobs of the planning system. You're working with, in my case, over 74 local authorities and 30 odd socio-economic and environmental partnerships. So it was a fantastic job. And then, as we all know, regional assemblies were abolished. So it feels like every job I did, it got abolished in the end. So I decided in 2010 that the safest way to do this was to actually work for myself. And I've never looked back, if I'm honest. Even though I sort of first couple of years, I did a lot of things that I never said I would do. So I did a lot of support around gypsies and planning for gypsies and travellers, minerals and waste, which I still do a little bit of now. You know, my view was good strategic planning, proper strategic planning had to come back at some point. I just had to dig my heels in and wait for that moment. I'm still waiting 10 years on. Yeah. But I'm still got my fingers crossed.
Let me talk a bit about that then, because I'm obviously as a strategic thinker. I mean, I was with the government when they were abolishing regional planning strategies, and one of the key arguments that was batting around the corridors at the time was regional planning. Regional plans didn't deliver. They were long on words, but they were complicated to actually deliver. They took a long time, and then the outcomes were never delivered on the ground. Now, I'll be interested to know what you think about that, and also, if you like, a bit about at what scale do you think planning is most effective? You know, at what point does it work?
Yeah, I think it's a shame that they sort of cut off the lifeblood of a new approach to strategic planning so early on, because, you know, let's remember it was only introduced through the 2004 Act, and most of the regional strategies sort of took a few years to get to being adopted. And you know, these were really big animals. They were trying to do an awful lot, and you know, there was also a period of transition where we didn't really know what these would look like in the end. So the first iteration of regional strategies, which were, you know, these were what the government based its decision on, were really just the first iterations. And I think we would have gone an awful lot further to get them much more slick and much more focused on the real strategic issues across regional areas. But actually, you know, despite the fact that I was planning director at the region, I think for me, most of the real wealth of information came at that sub-regional level, and that's the geography I think I would pitch it at. I work on the basis of what I call the Goldilocks principles to strategic planning geography. I think it has to work in a geography that's big enough to implement national policy in a meaningful way, and not just planning policy, but transport, economic, climate, all the issues around climate change, everything like that. But it also has to reflect local context and local circumstances. So it has to be at that sort of spatial geography that can do that role. It can influence upwards, but also really tackle some very different local issues on the ground. And, you know, so in the Southeast, we had strategies for the South Coast, which were very much around regeneration. We had strategies for growth around the Milton Keynes area, which was 3 regional strategies working together. And then we had other areas where there was very different approach. So it wasn't a one size fits all across the region. So for me, that's the geography. That's where strategic planning is best fixed. And it manages growth on different geographies as well at that level as well. You know, it doesn't assume that every bit that you do in terms of strategic planning, every topic, every issue you deal with is managed on the same geography, but it at least gives you that sort of common place to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're talking in a week that the government's issued its net zero carbon strategy, and I noticed that within that document they talk about certain decisions being taken at different levels. So there's a little table that talks about, you know, decisions that be taken at national level, and they use the R word. They talk about decisions being taken at a regional level and then at local level. I mean, I suppose I feel I can predict the answer to this. I mean, did you recognise that as being legitimate? Do you see that is necessary, that certain decisions need to be taken at a bigger scale?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, if you talk to colleagues in Department of Transport, they never moved away from the regional words. They always operated on that level, and as did other departments. In fact, I think the only one that went so local was Mr. Pickles' department post 2010. And I accept that was to do with localism, but a lot of the issues that support long-term sustainable growth, which is what strategic planning is fundamentally there to do, have to operate on a much bigger geography. And, you know, for me, it's about integrating the different issues, not just spatial priorities, housing, growth and distribution, spatial distribution, but transport and other infrastructure, dealing with the big issues around climate change and the environment, as well as social inequalities. So, you know, having a department, you know, you could argue the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities is a move back to the sort of super departments that we used to have around, you know, John Prescott's Office of Deputy Prime Minister, or we had DETR before that, Department of Environment, Transport and Regions. So getting that integration across government departments is going to be vital going forward, but it also has to be integration across tiers of local government and central government. So I think we need a much better systems approach to growth if we're going to get this right.
Well, I also think I'm hoping we come on to talk about the sort of better integration of the thinking and sort of trying to better join up the dots. And I think that I've been talking about remembering that places need to thrive, and you know, people talk about growth quite often, but sometimes the two are mixed. A place can thrive without growing, but also you do need growth. And I think that planning for that. But before we get to that, let me talk about you know, the 2004 system. We mentioned it. Now, of course, one of the key components of the 2004 legislation was indeed a regional planning leg, if you like. It was, you know, that was the basis, and you had a community plan process and you had a local plan process, and the three of them worked together to deliver local objectives within a framework that saw a bigger picture. Now, of course, that was seen to be replaced by this duty to cooperate, which was part of the reform. Now, you could argue that that's worked because some plans have got through the system and so must have been able to tick the duty to cooperate box, but whenever you talk to people, they all say, "Oh, this just doesn't work." I mean, the duty to cooperate is just has been an empty vessel. If that's the case, why do you think it hasn't worked?
So I distinguish between the question, did it work as a legal process mechanism? And I think yes, a lot of local authorities did manage to get over that hurdle, as opposed to did it result in good strategic planning or planning outcomes? And I think that's a very different question. So a lot of local authorities, I would argue, that managed to pass the duty to cooperate and get sound plans at the end, didn't necessarily get good plans in the end, good place shaping plans. So I think, you know, it is very much a process driven mechanism, and a lot of work goes into joining the dots in terms of who said what, who agreed when, and when they said it. But it doesn't really bring that sort of proper integration of the issues that support growth in a place, around a place. And I think that's where it's sort of fallen apart. And I think it's far, far more difficult where you've got two tiers. And in some places you've got three tiers because you've got combined authorities involved as well. They've all got different functions around supporting growth, as well as the sort of statutory planning functions. And the duty to cooperate doesn't really help bring all these together, because the responsibility and the failure ultimately sits with one single local planning authority. And I think that's probably its biggest failure, is the fact that, it's that one single authority that gets the blame if nobody else plays ball. But equally, it's the first test that gets tested examination, and it's the one that forces a local planning authority to go back to the start again, compared to any other test. So, there has to be a better way of doing this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you fail the duty to cooperate test, it stops. You don't go on to look at anything else. It's a failure of the first resort, if you like. But is there anywhere that you think that has grasped the idea that bigger than local planning works, and is a good example about where big, ambitious, sort of strategic thinking is being undertaken now, that you say, yeah, they're doing it well?
Well, probably and where I put a lot of effort in the last few years in my sort of day job was around the joint strategic plans, and up until recently we had 5 of these new style plans moving forward, where there was a real recognition that if ambition is going to be realised, you had to do more than just the duty to cooperate. So that was South Essex, South West Hertfordshire, Oxfordshire, which we all know about through the growth plan, Greater Exeter, and the southwest area around Bristol. That one has now fallen apart because it fell, and it was the real pilot. It was the one that was leading the way on this new style of plan, and it fell at examination. The Greater Exeter one fell apart because of the decision making, and as you'll know, you have to have a joint decision-making structure through Section 29 if you're going to have one single decision maker, and none of these have got that. So Greater Exeter fell at, similar to Greater Manchester, when one partner decided they didn't want to go forward with the plan. So there's only 3 left. The Oxfordshire one is bound by its growth deal with government, so it's chugging along slowly but surely, and it has managed to publish its latest Reg 18, just finished the consultation. And I think, there's been a lot of criticism, but given the constraints of the system, I think they've done a really good job. South West Herts and South Essex are both continuing. I'm not convinced the South Essex one will make it to the sort of even the start line, because I think there's just too much happening. And the fundamental problem with this is that they are high-level strategic plans which don't fit. They're being tested through a detailed local planning system. Yeah. So when the government rewrote the rule book in 2012, they didn't take account of the fact that some local authorities would still want to do these high-level frameworks. And I think that's the nub of the issue. So I hope Oxfordshire make it through, but it's going to take them much longer than I think the government or the local authorities anticipate.
Well, I think that's the case. Even the Oxford deal was there was a suggested timeline which they're not going to meet, are they?
No.
They're already beyond the timelines. It goes to show some of this stuff takes time. But it's interesting that you talk about the sort of the big ambition stuff. And I as you might want to have picked up, I've written a piece with Lord Matthew Taylor and Paul Tucker, which was talking about changes that might need to be made to the MPPF that would make some of this big ambition easier. And it is about looking at the soundness test and the way in which you look at viability and deliverability, particularly on whether infrastructure is going to be in place and paid for. And I suppose the argument was that at the moment, it's very difficult for local authorities to actually demonstrate that in 10 or 15 years' time, things will have happened if it doesn't fit in with either the Department of Transport's programmes for delivery or whatever. And I suppose that would you argue that is where a bigger than local picture would help? There's sort of, if you had a regional plan, you could just hold that ambition in view, if you like.
Yeah, and there's lots wrapped up in that. One is that it's incredibly difficult for local authorities and partners to make decisions today that they can't see the results of for the next 5 to 10 years. There's no tangible results for communities or politicians. They can't demonstrate the value today. You know, climate change, look at that agenda. So many of the decisions that are going to impact the next 10, 20, 30 years have to be made today. But it's really hard asking politicians to make difficult decisions in that way. And so I guess that's one thing. I think the other thing is, and I may be a bit controversial, I'm a professional planner, but I think a lot of these decisions should be taken out of the statutory planning system. I think the statutory planning system's being expected to do all the heavy lifting. And I think a lot of the issues around integration and growth, and I actually think some of the decisions around spatial distribution and housing numbers could be taken out of the statutory planning system and into a different form, maybe growth boards who have a direct role to make decisions around that. They still need to be delivered through the statutory planning system. So you still need the testing process, the testing of soundness. But if it's done at a higher level, strategic level, outside the statutory planning system through a partnership, and is bound by some sort of contract between central and local government. So, for example, you mentioned, government agencies. If we can get tie-in Highways England or whatever they're called, I can't remember what they're called now, Natural England, all these agencies as well as government departments that are needed, if we can tie them into some form of contract at that strategic level, so that when you get a local plan going into an examination, so many of the decisions and that certainty, that investor certainty is already there because that alignment has happened elsewhere. So, I think there are ways we could do this quickly. There are ways we could do this without planning legislation.
I'll be interested in your views about a digital agenda, and I suppose I've argued that the digital agenda for planning does open up the opportunities for data to be held on a national level. If everybody downloaded their evidence base onto a platform that was accessible across the country and across the UK, then you'd be able to analyse what was happening, and you could also model what might happen if you were to move growth from one area to another, and we'll be able to shape infrastructure provision, etc., etc. And of course, when I put that sort of thinking, muddled though it may sound, that sort of thinking alongside a levelling up agenda, do you think that the way to a bigger than local picture is through a digital approach, or do you think that you need the regional approach which be supported by digital thinking?
I think it has a really important role to play, and I think it's like all decisions around data. I think there is an interpretation. And there is, if you go back to the conversation about vision, I think vision is where you want to transform an area, and data doesn't necessarily lend itself to that sort of process. When you're looking to the future, you're trying to transform an area to meet a certain vision that is shared across local authorities and partners. I will hark back to the regional days when we had regional observatories, very data-driven observatories. They were fantastic. It was doing exactly the sort of role you talked about, where information and data was gathered on a consistent basis. But there was specialists there to interrogate the data and help the laymen, the planners and others use that data really effectively. So I think your answer is really the latter, what you said. I think it has a really important role to play, but it's not the only solution. But it is an incredibly and increasingly important part of the solution.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think that is interesting. That idea is you can have all the data, but who's got the vision? I suppose some might argue that that's where the government steps in. If it, am I pushing for a national plan? Well, perhaps not a plan in a statutory sense, but perhaps a national strategy might help. Which brings me to sort of some of the thinking that has been taking place on a bigger than local scale, and I want to talk about the Cambridge sort of arc and the strategic thinking that's going on there. At one level, I think that you think it's great that you've got an ambition for growth and for a thriving community along that arc, and the people are thinking about how the connectivity between those cities, Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes, Bedford, all work. But on the other hand, I come back to worrying about the implementation of it at a local level, and I think that you might have heard me say this before, that I think it's a great ambition, but I worry that in its implementation, all the local authorities along the line are going to be too embroiled in worrying about their housing delivery tests and whether or not they're going to lose appeals and whether they've got a 5-year land supply, to be able to lift their eyes above those concerns into a bigger picture. And I just wonder what you feel about that, and also what you think might need to be done to stop that grand ambition being derailed by incremental appeals being allowed through the process.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think 5-year land supply and housing delivery test is the enemy of good planning, in my view. It has, as you say, has got in the way of being able to plan long term and be visionary and really change an area, because you're so bogged down in trying to make sure you're delivering for the here and now. And that's a resource issue as much as anything else. The planning side has got to do that in order to prove success and prove that it's doing its job. So the planners don't have the ability or the time to lift their heads above that. In the Oxford-Cambridge arc perspective, I mean, there's been lots of debate about it being the fact it's not a coherent spatial planning area, but over history, a big bit of infrastructure, the M25 sort of a central government intervention has totally transformed spatial planning, hasn't it? So the M25 transformed the whole the way London worked. So investing in a place like that for good reasons and for the benefit of the country, which is what the government is saying, has an ability then to make that a logical, coherent spatial planning area. But I think in terms of your question around how we make sure that big picture stuff is translated on the ground, that has to be done through the building blocks. And I think, as I understand it at the moment, you've got sort of 4 core building blocks. You've got the Oxfordshire one, Cambridge and Peterborough at the other end, and then you've got a couple in the middle. And I think having a building block with, whether you call it a growth board in each of these areas, but a sort of partnership in each of these 4 building blocks to translate what's happening in that bigger picture on the ground and make sure planning authorities are doing their bit and are getting the support that they need is the only way it's going to work. So this has to be a really strong partnership between central government and local government. Central government can write the best framework, the most ambitious framework, that they like, but you're absolutely right. Unless they make sure local authorities have got the resources and the structures and the ability to deliver it on the ground, then it won't be realised in 20 years, let alone 30 years or even 40 years.
I said I'd come back to something which I want to do now, which is the comment you were making earlier, which was talking about, and you referred to it there, it's sort of the lack of joined up thinking. Different departments doing different things. We've seen the net zero carbon strategy issue today. Is planning seen as the main delivery vehicle for it? Well, no, it's not. It's referred to. I've been on seminars which have launched, advice to authorities where planning is seen as being the vehicle to do all this stuff. Now, sort of joined up thinking, both across government, but also in tiers of local authority. From what you've said, you see that as really important. And why do you think it isn't as effective as it should be? Is it because the governance structures aren't right yet, or is it because we need to invent something different?
I think it's partly to do with the fact that there's very few strategic planning thinkers within government anymore. I mean, you've gone now. There was, there used to be really strong capacity to support regions and structure plans within government, people that understood. There were systems thinkers, and I always say, when people say to me, well, let's just join local planning teams up to do the strategic planning. And for me, strategic planning, I would describe as that sort of, say it's a ringmaster role. It's the role where you bring all the different things together and work within that statutory planning system. But it's also very much about, I always describe that again, my role as marriage guidance counsellor, because it's about looking at different partners and the different things they bring to the party and making sure there are mutual benefits, but equally making sure that decisions are made in the interest of the greater good. And that's a real skill in itself, and we don't have a huge amount of that sort of skill within local government or central government. But in central government's sense, I think there's just a total fragmentation of who does what, and I think there's probably much more of a culture. I think local government is similar in that there's a culture of this is mine, don't touch it. I'm responsible for climate change, go away. And I think Department of DHCLG, as it was, I think was the one that should have been the integration. It should have been the ringmaster, and it should have brought all the different roles together. In the way that the government offices used to do. And, I never really understood the value of government offices until they were gone. Because it's true, they were just sort of, a thorn in my side at the regional level. But when you look at the loss of that integration, they were the ones that helped everybody else translate government policy at a more meaningful level, geography. And actually, the government offices probably in the sort of bonfire of the regions was probably one of the biggest losses, I think, to public policy in the way that we do it.
I think that's right. I mean, you remind me of the Joni Mitchell quote, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Which is, so I want to probably give you the opportunity there. You've got a white paper that came out and said we're going to do this planning reform, where we're going to tear down the system to its foundations and rebuild a new system. And then you've got a new Secretary of State and a sort of a review. I say, well, let's have a pause and see whether or not we're doing the right thing, and an impending announcement, one assumes, about the direction of travel. So you're now Secretary of State, and you've got an opportunity to say, well, okay, this is what you need to do, and what would you be doing?
I would be doing I would be working very much around devolution as opposed to decentralisation, and I would be working with local leaders. I think that I'd be trying to reset that relationship between local and central government, and I think more than any time ever before in my history, post-COVID, that is what we've got to do in terms of social care and everything, all these wider issues and the funding. And if we don't do that, then we really haven't got a chance of dealing with all the other nice to have bits, because we're going to be so focused on doing the really essential health bits, keeping people alive effectively. So if I was Mr. Gove, I would be working really hard on these devolution deals right across the country, and I wouldn't be letting local authorities opt out. And I think it's at the moment it's pitched voluntarily, but I think it has to be mandatory. I think there has to be some sort of deal or contract between central and local government with sub-regions, whatever shape they are. And I don't necessarily believe that needs to have, the county mayoral model, but there needs to be at the heart of that much, much more robust accountability locally and more robust accountability nationally. So for me, I would be making the sort of the growth deals or devolution deals, county deals, whatever you call them, I would be making them mandatory. And I don't know if you remember, Steve, but we used to have multi-area agreements, and I think they were the sort of they weren't quite deals in the way we've got now, but they were contracts between central government and local government to make sure that everybody knew what their role was to support growth, and there was real accountability and checks and balances in that. So for me, that if I was going to make one change, and strategic planning is absolutely at the heart of that, I would be saying don't let any local authorities walk away from this. Every local authority within 6 months has to put their hand up and say, I want to be part of a new relationship with government as part of a strategic approach, and that could be through growth deals, whatever, growth boards, or whatever model of governance suits that area. But I wouldn't let any local authorities walk away from them, and I wouldn't let any government department walk away from it either.
It's interesting, and I suppose you talking earlier about being a professional planner and not wanting to sound controversial by saying you don't need these plans, but I wonder whether in that sort of model, whether as a professional planner we should be less bothered about whether or not everywhere has the same sort of statutory plan, as long as they've got a plan, and whether that be an economic document, a growth document, a way of setting down of what they think their ambitions should be, whether we should be more flexible, have a plan if you need a plan, but in some places you need something else. But actually, it's all planning.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I'm not saying that everybody has to have a growth framework that sits outside the statutory planning system. That could be a combined authority spatial development strategy. It could be a joint strategic plan, both of which sit within the statutory planning system, but it could be, as you say, something else. For me, it comes down to where that decision making and accountability sits, and I think the government could change that quite easily by making a body or a person accountable for certain decisions, through a growth deal or primary legislation or whatever. But it's not about the framework, it's not about what the plan looks like and whether it sits in the statutory planning system or not. It's about who makes the decisions and how that governance structure supports these decisions. I think at the local level, you will always need a statutory system, because you're dealing with land and values and everything else. And I think we know that the planning system, the legal part of the planning system is absolutely essential to deliver a lot of the development, but it doesn't all have to be done through that route.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you sort of perhaps as a way of sort of counterpointing that view, which is on the other hand, you hear a lot of talk about provably popular outcomes, about street level voting on things, localism, but back to localism. And I suppose you probably answered the question already, but you'd see that still being managed through some sort of statutory process, neighbourhood plans, statutory plans, but with the big picture stuff being much more flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. In my experience, working with local communities is much easier. You get much more positive, proactive input when difficult decisions are taken out of the equation. And I will hark back to structure plan days. I always said the blame culture, which Mr. Pickles famously got rid of, actually worked to the benefit of everyone. So in structure plan days, the government prepared its regional planning guidance, dictated to each structure plan authority what their number was, and that broad growth strategy. The county could then blame the government, but then go on and divvy up the housing number and develop a growth strategy that suited that area. And then each of the districts could then blame the county for the number, but deliver it in a much more positive environment with local communities, because the local community interaction was very much about shaping it on the ground where it meant something, and there was still so much that still had to be decisions that had to be made at that level that informed that process, but they weren't bogged down as we are now with numbers, frankly. And I also think that when they took away strategic planning in any real form as part of localism, they devolved decision making to the lowest level, the sort of local planning authorities, where councillors live and work within their own communities. So how on earth can you expect them to make some of these horrendous decisions? And then when the councillors are brave enough to make these decisions, they lose at the next election or lose their seat as leader, or it's such a fragile situation that doesn't support long-term planning. It doesn't support good planning decisions. So for me, it's breaking it down and taking some of these big decisions out of the equation, but then building in community engagement in a much, much, much more meaningful way at the local level once these decisions are out the way. And most local communities, they argue about numbers, but they're, academic numbers, aren't they? They don't mean anything until it hits their street or it hits their community.
Yeah, and also sometimes I would look at a figure and say, someone's got 5,332 houses, and you start thinking, well, how on earth, over a 5-year period, how on earth can you be quite so precise? And particularly as things change, it takes a year to build 65 houses or whatever. But no, there's there's some really strong themes there, which I think are interesting to reflect on: the top-down nature of planning, the effectiveness of bigger than local thinking, but the importance of engaging with the communities, and I think that's been a fascinating discussion, Catriona, and I thank you for it. I think that you and I were probably never going to solve the problem of the planning system in this conversation, but I hope that we've certainly thrown out a few ideas that may help shape thinking going forward. But can I thank you very much for joining me today, and it's been great to talk to you.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you.